Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. Now there can be absolutely no doubt that the Bentley GT is one of the bargains of the century. The thing is though, if you don't pick the right car, then they can become a really expensive nightmare. I myself spent a very long time looking for this one, doing lots of research, and I didn't buy at the bottom of the rung of the market, and still I have had some issues. In this video, I'm going to tell you the problems that I've run across. I'm going to tell you about maintenance costs, service schedules, and crucially, we're going to look at all the main areas that can go wrong and that you need to check before you yourself buy one. When it comes to spec, there are a few things to look out for. The first is the year of the car. In 2006 or 2007, it's a little bit shaky there was a mild update which was done to these cars, but really importantly, that also rerouted the vacuum pipes from the gearbox to the top of the engine. That, as you shall see when we talk later about some of the pitfalls, is quite an expensive thing to fix when it goes wrong. So generally speaking, the later cars are a bit more desirable. They also had a few other detail changes. The rear suspension was changed, which I think probably makes the ride a little bit better. In 2007 or 2008, the Speed model was introduced. So that was also when you had the facelift. That does have a bit more power, about another 50 horsepower. I don't think that makes a huge difference, but the chassis was again subtly improved so that they're even better handling. In my view, when you have a car like this, you don't really drive it that fast, so it seems a bit pointless, but they do carry a premium, and the press, when they were reviewed at the time, really liked them. The Mulliner pack is a really desirable option. It gives you these bigger, nicer wheels. It also gives you some changes in the interior of the car. So you have drilled metal pedals, you have an aluminium knurled knob on top of the gear change. The leather is quilted. All in all, it really helps to lift the ambience of the car. Massage seats, something else which is pretty desirable. And apart from that, just be careful about the spec that you get. Some of these interiors in particular were really wildly coloured and now look really dated. Generally speaking, a dark interior with the Mulliner pack is what you should be looking for. Of course, if you're just going to keep the car long term, then it doesn't really matter. Just get whatever spec you want. But generally speaking, the darker colours like this one for the exterior, there are some red ones which I think look quite nice, but I think that the stranger colours, the more adventurous colours, make them harder to sell on afterwards. And these are really well built and quite reliable. The problems tend to come because they are so cheap but quite expensive to maintain, so people don't do the required maintenance and then things start to mount up and fail. In terms of servicing, what you should be looking at yearly is an oil service, which is going to be about sort of between 600 and 800 depending on where you do it. And then you have the main service, which is every 4 years, which is going to be 12 to 1400 pounds, which is the spark plug service. On top of that, of course, there is all the other stuff that you will have to replace as it goes wrong. If you have a look on the Flying Bee website, these are specialists based very close to the factory. They've been really helpful with advice and so on with my own car. That will show you roughly what their service costs are and what you should expect. I think every 10 years you have to do the poly belt, so that raises the cost of the main service by another £400 or £500, something along those lines. But all in all, the general maintenance costs themselves, in terms of servicing, aren't too expensive. It's just that when things go wrong, they can be extremely expensive, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So let's start with what you need to check in the interior. The first thing is you need to check for damp, both in the front passenger footwell, which is potentially really serious because there's some electronics under there that can get damaged and be quite costly to repair. And then also in the back by the rear seats, you want to make sure it's all absolutely dry. In the rear seats, what you can get is that there's a drain hole by the rear spoiler which can get blocked up. Water goes down into the boot and eventually seeps through to the back. So check the back of the boot, check those rear seats. There should be absolutely no sign of damp. Now there's a couple of biggies to look into next. The parking brake does tend to go wrong. I think that the housings on the rear, it's an electric parking brake, they tend to crack and then you need to get it replaced, and that can be quite costly. So make sure that when you take it for a test drive, you stop somewhere with a relatively steep incline and then just use the parking brake and make sure that it is holding. The other classic that seems to happen to all these cars is the leather roof lining. Now these are beautifully trimmed, but after a few years the glue gives and the roof lining actually starts to sag. Now when I bought this one, I checked that and it was absolutely fine. In the short space of time that I've had it, I've had about 3 months, but now coming up to the summer, and I think with the heat from the sun, mine, as you can see, has also now failed, which is something I'm going to have to sort out. The standard infotainment system also is pretty awful on these, and there is nothing that can be done to update the current system or the existing system to work properly with modern phones. So the other option that you have, as in this car, is to put an updated one. This is a Ben-Hur. It does work very well, but the only downside of having one of these is that the controls look a little bit cheap compared to the rest of the interior. Overall though, it is desirable to have because it gives you Google Maps, it gives you music streaming, it just makes life a lot more comfortable and a lot more modern. While you're in here, make sure that the various functions work, like the heated seats, the massage option, if you have that. All the windows go up and down correctly. When you open the doors, they should dop a tiny bit and then lift back up when you close them. The air suspension isn't particularly more troublesome than other similar systems, but it can fail, so make sure that the car is very level. If you can, get to the car when it hasn't been started for a few hours, cold engine, you should be doing that anyway when you're buying a car, and just check that it's not sagging on either side, because of course the air pumps can temporarily bring it back. To make sure it's working properly, you can click the suspension button and raise the car and then lower it again. Make sure that's all working properly. I've speeded up the sequence here. It is usually a bit slower than this. The big thing though to check is around the engine bay. Now, again, the engine is a pretty reliable unit, but there is a design flaw, especially in these early cars, which can be very expensive to rectify. There is a vacuum line which runs just above the gearbox, so somewhere down there. Now you can see how tightly packed this engine is. To get to that vacuum line, the only way is to drop the whole engine and gearbox. Now what tends to happen is where it's at a junction, where it's a little bit under pressure, it's a rubber line, it tends to split. And when you have to replace this 2-pound bit of line, you have to drop the whole engine and gearbox. On some of the later cars, it's rerouted here to the back, the top of the back of the engine, so you can get to it without dropping everything. But even then, I was looking at a 2007 car that had had this very job done, and it still cost about £6,000 or £7,000. So I'm not quite sure what is going on there. Make sure you check the engine for any fuel smells, and of course make sure that it is idling smoothly. So the symptoms of this vacuum line going is, first of all, you can actually hear it if you listen close in. Secondly, it will usually start making the engine run quite lumpily at idle, and you will get a warning light on the dash. While you're here, do check the coolant, make sure it's nice and clean, and the other key things to look out for are at the back of the car. Here is the spoiler that I mentioned before to do with the drain holes and then getting water in the back of the car. As well as that, you need to check that it's actually working. They do fail pretty regularly, so it should be able to move up and move back down, which you can do from inside the cabin. This brake light as well is absolutely renowned for failing, and unfortunately to change it, I believe the rear window has to be removed, so it's quite an expensive thing to do, so just make sure that that is also working. Now these GTs have 2 batteries. They have a small starter battery on the right hand side of the car and then a larger systems battery on the left hand side. There is a special procedure to be followed when removing either one of the batteries. So first of all, make sure that they are both in good health. The smaller battery is pretty cheap, about 120, 130 pounds less if you go to dedicated battery place, but the bigger battery can be more expensive. The other thing is though, if they are taken out in the wrong order or disconnected in the wrong order, it can cause one of the problems that I had on my own car, and that is there is a battery safety relay that will cut out the batteries in the event of a crash. In my case, the starter battery failed. I had it replaced by the AA. It might have already been a problem before that. I'm not 100% sure, but in either way, that isolator relay failed. So the car would work, but it would occasionally just cut the battery out, and you'd have to reset everything, all the windows, all that kind of stuff. From Bentley, that part is about £550. I was able to find it secondhand for less than 100, fitted it myself. It's about an hour job to fit. It's awkward, it's a little bit awkward to get to, but it's not too bad. You just have to remove that starter battery. Do be aware of that though, because if the car keeps resetting itself, that could be what is causing it. And again, it was Andrew at Flying Bee who helped me diagnose the issue with the starter relay and told me how to go about replacing it. Now, another thing that affects these cars, as well as any other modern car, is the TPMS system. And on this, I did have the warning light on. I looked into various options, and generally speaking, the batteries on all 4 of my sensors were gone. To replace them would have been about £500, but it wasn't guaranteed that it would sort it. The older systems in the early cars like this, up to the facelift, can be a bit troublesome. So you might end up replacing all the sensors and them still not working. But the beauty of the earlier cars is that up to the end of 2005, they did not need to have that system working for an MOT. So even if you have the light on, it won't fail its MOT. And if you want, you can do what I ended up doing, which is just get it programmed out. So it's not going to be the bane of anybody else's life. As with any other car that you're going to buy, just make sure you check the main things like the panel gaps, the state of the paint. The paintwork on these is pretty flawless. So if there is anything, if it's not glass smooth, it means that it has had some work done to it and it has been repainted. Not necessarily a tragedy, but you should be aware of it, of course. The other thing is the wheels. These split rims, these are 2-piece, I think, on the Mulliners. They can be expensive to refurbish, so check out the state of those. The tyres, they are quite big, they're quite expensive, so make sure that you factor in the cost if they need to be replaced. The boot release can be an issue as well. It is a motorized unit. Now I don't know if it's an option or not. If it is, this car doesn't have it, maybe because it's an earlier car. So it's electronically activated, but on this, it's manual to open and close. That micro switch can fail, not a huge deal, but again, be aware of it if there are issues. And what you get with some cars, certainly with the later cars, is a fully automated boot that will open and close on its own. Again, those have a propensity to fail, so make sure that if your car has that, then it is working. One last thing, let's talk a bit about how they are supposed to drive. The suspension is not quite as comfortable as you would think. It is great on most surfaces, but if you have broken sort of bumps, potholes, that kind of stuff, then it can be a little bit jarring. It comes from the back end. I think the later cars were maybe slightly improved, but also Volkswagen, i.e. Bentley, decided to try and make this a little bit more sporty than the later Bentleys. The flip side of that is that they do actually handle pretty well. They're really hefty things, about 2,400 kilos, but all the same, you can really chuck them down the road, and body control is pretty good, and they have loads of grip. Make sure the engine is smooth, pulls all the way through, absolutely no warning lights. If you have an engine warning light, it could be the dreaded vacuum issue, it could be something simple, but you absolutely don't want to risk it. You'll find that the steering is pretty numb. Again, it doesn't really matter too much in a car of this type. There's a bit of precision there. You can adjust the suspension and firm it up. It doesn't change dramatically, and I would say that the softer setting is where you'll end up keeping it most of the time, unless you're really driving it quite hard. And I'm now going to give you the most important bit of advice of all. Whatever you do when you are searching for one of these, buy the absolute best you can afford. There are lots of cars at the bottom of the market. Here in the UK, 15 grand, I suppose, but some of them even lower than that. I had a look at all those cars. They always look good in the adverts, but in actual fact, they all have problems. So try and go for at least sort of 18 to 20,000 pounds when you're buying one. If you're in the US and in Europe, they are more expensive. They're not quite as cheap as they are here. I don't know why. But again, start with a baseline that they start at and then go as high as you can possibly afford. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see a more in-depth road test, then have a look at this, or do have a look at some of my other videos as well. Thank you all so much for watching, and good luck with your purchase of your Bentley GT.